I'm Anne Butera, and this is Sips of Inspiration. Today I'm chatting with Laura Bray, and I'm so excited to have Laura here. And one of the things that I'm excited about is just the fact that I have connected with Laura. My friend Dana introduced me to her site, and I read her blog posts, and I signed up for her newsletter, and she seemed such an interesting person, and I reached out to her, and she was so nice and welcoming and encouraging, and just making a connection with a kindred spirit like that is always so wonderful. And I just want to encourage you, if you are encountering a new person that you find their blog or that you find on Instagram, reach out and say hi. You never know what kind of connections you make. And I think it's so important right now that we do make connections and we do create community, because the creative community is so welcoming and encouraging. And it's really something that we need right now. So I'm going to let Laura talk a little bit about who she is and what it is that she does, and then we'll start with some of our questions about inspiration. So hi, Laura. Thanks for being here today.
Hi, and I totally agree. I'm grateful that Dana found me, and I really treasure our connection as well as my connection with Dana now. It's put a little bright spot into my work and my days. I'm an embroidery and textile artist. I live in the Pacific Northwest in Washington, just over the river from Portland, Oregon. I've been married to my husband for almost 25 years, and I have a 15-year-old daughter who has a little guinea pig who is a bit neurotic, but we enjoy his company. I teach embroidery, or I used to teach in person. That has been put on the back burner, and I'm working on doing some online classes because I feel that the domestic hand arts are important to keep alive, and they also create a sense of community. Stitching together with a group of usually women is really satisfying, and it opens you up for exchanging recipes and talking about books, and I just really love spreading my love of embroidery.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. So my first question is, where do you find inspiration, and what do you do to help the inspiration start flowing again when you're feeling uninspired or when you're feeling stuck?
I find, of course, my inspiration, a lot of my images are nature, but they're also domestic images like teacups, and they reflect my hobbies. So I find a lot of my inspiration in my other hobbies. So like reading, I actually use books. I belong to a book club that's called Book to Art, and we read a book and then everyone makes a piece of art inspired by that book, which is a really fun experience because it changes your reading experience. You're reading it looking for imagery. You can look for quotes that you might want to turn into an illustration. You can, even the book art, you might see a color combination that you hadn't thought of on the cover of the book, or there's a silhouette and you start to think of ways you can bring the art of silhouette into your artwork. So books play a big part. And finally, my childhood memories. If you read my Behind the Hoops series, you'll often get a childhood story of mine. And I don't even go into it realizing that those memories are flowing through to my art. So I would say, as far as when I need to get my inspiration flowing, I will take a walk in the woods, I will meditate, but I also sometimes just pull one of my craft books off a shelf or a magazine. It doesn't even have to be a craft magazine. Sometimes it's a science magazine, and start flipping through it. And before I know it, I'm, writing in my sketchbook a big list of ideas that I want to get started on.
Oh, that's great. I really love that idea of the book. Was it Book to Art? Is that what your group was called? Of being inspired by the book. What sorts of books do you read in that group?
We read fiction. So it's really, it's basic fiction, Oprah Club style kind of book club style books. Um, but we've read some children's books, some YA as well. Those are always really image rich. It's based on, there's a series of books about using your library as an artist, from the collections and things like that. It's based, the book to art club movement came out of those books, and I believe Design Sponge has a series of videos about artists using the New York City Library. I don't know if you've seen that.
I haven't. I'll have to look for that, and maybe I can link that in our.
I'll send you the links to the books in this series. It's really inspiring.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's always good to have a few techniques in your back pocket to refer back to anytime when you're feeling stuck, or if you just need to shake things up and you want to try something different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Going about your usual process, sometimes you need something new. So I'm going to have
Yeah.
to keep that in mind. Thank you for that. So my next question is, what's the biggest creative challenge that you have faced, and how did you work through that?
Well, it's time, finding the time to be creative. I think most women struggle against that. They have jobs, they have possibly aging parents, they have young children. We have a lot of roles, and we often put ourselves on the back burner. And so our creativity is one of the things, the forms of self-care that we push aside. And the way I've over the years developed a process for getting out of that is that I always have to set up my work, because one of the biggest things is I have 10 minutes or 30 minutes or even an hour. I don't want to waste that running around my studio trying to find all the bits and pieces and transferring an embroidery pattern onto fabric, and before I know it, all the prep work has taken up whatever creative time I have. So I've tried to get more in the process of, like, if I know I'm going to have some time the next day, the night before, as I'm closing up my office and my studio, I'll lay out the project. And sometimes I'll even load my needles with a couple colors of floss. I can't tell you how luxurious it feels to sit down and have preloaded needles. I know that sounds like a small thing, but it means I can really literally sit down for 5 minutes and start stitching immediately without any prep work. And that significantly cuts my time. And somehow making time for prep work doesn't feel like I'm being creative, and it doesn't feel frivolous, which is sometimes, I think, a block a lot of people have. You feel like you're being industrious. So doing that during the day sets you up for when you can sit down and just be creative. I also keep a cookie tin with a small project that I can just grab and watch TV in the evening, or when I used to take my daughter to piano lessons or things like that. I could just grab the tin and go.
That's great. Great ideas for being able to create in small little bits of time, which I think people sometimes dismiss working in small bits like that, but it really adds up. If you do a little bit each day, uh, it's still being creative, and you can get a lot done that way.
Well, I believe in always doing things in a sustainable manner. And so just because the person you're following on Instagram has 5 hours a day to be in their studio doesn't mean you do. And so you look at that 5 hours and say, I can never do that. You're never going to get a practice. But if you're more realistic about what kind of a practice you can sustain, I think you're more likely to be successful at it. And I think you'd be surprised by how much your time expands once you get over that.
Oh, yeah. That's great. So my last question is about either creative advice that you have received. So what's the best piece of creative advice that you've ever received? Or if there wasn't anything that really resonated you, then what's the biggest lesson that you've learned on your creative journey?
Well, I can't think of a specific piece of advice because I think it's the same message that I've gotten from a lot of artists and mentors, which is to slow down and really treat your art practice as a practice, a process, and not about the finished product. Again, I think with the internet, we see all these finished products and they're being sold, and we lose track of what went into the making of that product. We see other people's styles and they seem so refined and finished. Those styles were developed over years of practice and experimentation. So the process is really what being an artist is about, I think, more than the actual finished product. Again, when you're dealing with the time, like I did, the blocks of time, it's hard. You want to hurry up and get that product out and have something to show for the time that you spent creating. But I'm really learning to hold my little steps and maybe my failures a little more precious. I just started sewing little books that have my different variations of stitches and some of the practice pieces and some of the pieces that I didn't really like, because embroidery is a little bit of a time, a piece of embroidery has a lot of hours involved in there, and it can be very frustrating to have something and you're not happy with the color choices you made or the stitch choices you made, but you feel like you can't throw it out, and then you're mad at yourself for having quote unquote wasted that time. So the way I've overcome that and really tried to change my mindset about focusing on the process and not the finished product is to create these, stitch sketchbooks, if you will, and take some pride in the progress that I've made and the lessons I've learned from some of the failures.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's great advice. And also, it's wonderful to have a body of work that you can look back on and see your progression and learn. You can learn so much too by looking back at those things. And I know, like um, embroidery, detailed botanical watercolors take a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
And it is there's the same sorts of feelings if you've been working on a piece for a long time and at the end you're not happy with it because of sometimes color choices too, just like you mentioned with the embroidery or whatever. Just I try and hold on to all of those things, and sometimes after a while going back to something I that I didn't initially like, I change my mind about it and I see something in it that I didn't see before. So yeah, I also love your idea of creating the sketchbooks that are stitched. One of my other guests, Jenny Blair, she's also an embroidery artist, and she would create little, she called them stitch books, and they were little sketchbooks of stitchery.
Mm-hmm.
Such a cool idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think I heard somebody call it archives, and I like the idea of having an archive of my work, which is kind of the finished piece has a lot of research behind it and a lot of experimentation. And so if you look at it as you're archiving that, it feels a little better and not so time wasteful. Maybe I'm too worried about time, but I think most women, because we do feel so crunched for time, need to play some mind games sometimes with ourselves to be allowed to do the art and the creative activities we want to do.
How do you store all of your archived art? Just curious.
Well, there's a book by Twyla Tharp, and she has boxes. She uses the cardboard file boxes of all of the pieces of inspiration that she uses to develop her choreography. And so I've started keeping small boxes for each large project that I keep archived things in, like inspiration, as well as works that maybe didn't work out, but they were part of the process to a finished piece.
Yeah, I'm always curious as to how people organize things and store things and make it easy to go back then. Because sometimes things, I know from my own experience, sometimes things kind of get lost in the shuffle or underneath a
Mhm.
pile of things and you forget about them. So for me, I think sometimes out of sight, out of mind with
Yeah.
both supplies and pieces that I've created or things that I've collected. So it's always a
Even
struggle.
even sketchbooks, I find I put it in my sketchbook and then I tend to forget about it. So I've started to try to make a practice, going back to how do I get inspiration flowing. I've tried to make it a practice to go into my old sketchbooks and start flipping through. I'm surprised by how much sounded like a great idea that I just let fall by the wayside. And I figure if I'm still interested in it when I do sit down to flip through it, it must be a really good idea and I should probably pursue it.
Well, and just having those to go back to is great because then it's not lost and something that you may have forgotten about can spark even new ideas and with a fresh perspective on it.
Right. I think, you were saying about that you might go back and then find that you like something that initially you had disregarded. I think sometimes our ability and our taste gets ahead of us and we're not ready for it yet. And it is important to go back because we may be ready to be more experimental with our colors or something like that. So it is important to look back, I think, and move forward with some stuff that you may be ahead of your own time.
That's a really interesting idea. So thank you so much, Laura, for joining me for Sips of Inspiration. And all of my viewers and readers, thank you for watching along. We'll see you next time.